Welcome to Behind the SME, the podcast where we dive into the stories of founders, leaders, and visionaries of small and medium-sized enterprises. As the CEO of a small business myself, I want to uncover what drives the success of SMEs by talking to those who are in the trenches, building their businesses from the ground up. I hope you enjoy the episode. Athena, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Great to have you here.
To be here. Thank you.
So we normally start by explaining how I know the guests, and we were introduced by Alex, a former guest on the podcast, a friend of mine. I asked him, who should we have on? And he said, number one, you've got to speak to Athena. And so here you are. Big shout out to Alex for that recommendation. But instead of me giving our listeners an overview of your career and probably butchering it, why don't you just give us a rundown of what you've been doing up to this point?
Yeah, just to say, thrilled to be here. And Alex's mic drop community is amazing. And so just in terms of how I ended up getting to meet Alex and being part of mic drop, if we go back to the beginnings, I'm currently a futurist and economist. I studied economics at university. That's what I weirdly wanted to do. Not many people want to have that as a career, but I just loved the fact that it gave me like a toolkit to understand the world and the way that people behave, and the things that I was seeing around me. And I did that for a few years. Then the financial crisis hit. And maybe we'll come back to that later, but that kind of changed a lot my perspective in terms of the usefulness of the discipline and how relevant it is for business. And then over time, I started focusing more on Foresight and how that set of tools and frameworks can help business leaders. I spent about 14, 15 years at Accenture, working with businesses and governments and advising on emerging trends. And then I decided to kind of do that on my own and have my own set of clients. And I was looking really for a way to, kind of articulate my own thinking more publicly, which can be hard to do when you spend a long time in a corporate environment. And that's when Alex's mic drop community came along. And so that's what I've been doing for the last few years, really working with my clients, trying to think about how the future might look different to today, and giving people both the tools and the space and the mindset to do that. And that's also why I'm thrilled to be having this conversation with you, because I think Foresight can be quite a lot, like the perception of it is that it's in the domain of governments and large corporates and having those departments, but actually in many ways SMEs are perfectly placed to use Foresight tools, and they're more agile, at the cutting edge of things. So very happy to be having this conversation.
Yeah, and I think really pertinent, because SME leaders typically are so in the weeds with what they're doing day to day that it's really hard to look up and try and see what's on the horizon, and you're in reactive mode 90% of the time. So we're going to spend some time talking today about that other 10% and things that leaders of small businesses can do practically to try and force themselves to look toward the horizon, and have a bit more foresight. Mm-hmm. I also studied economics. I don't know if you knew that, but I think either you are a economics nerd or you're not. And as soon as I learned about economics as a concept, I was like, that's a bit of me. Were you more micro or macro? What was your
macro?
Where you preferred a bit of macro? Did you?
I love macro.
Yeah.
So I think because well, I don't quite know. Maybe because there was more about kind of what's happening internationally that you had to think about. And I also studied politics initially as well. So
yeah, me too. Hey, look, we've got a really similar
Where did you
So-
study? Now I'm like,
No, I studied over in Cardiff. We did a
okay.
mix of micro and macro the whole way through.
Mm-hmm.
I liked micro because I really enjoyed and knew I wanted to run a small business, but I
Okay.
also really enjoyed like the big levers that government pull and see how that affects the economy. So I found it all fascinating. And weirdly, in the job I have now, running Keen as an R&D advisory firm, you get to play around with kind of this intersection between small business and macroeconomic
Uh,
policy. So for an economics nerd like me, it's actually heaven. And I got to talk about kind of monetary policy for loads of years, which,
Dream.
exactly, when you're wired like us, that is a dream.
Yeah.
Let's start by defining foresight. Let's get a bit of an understanding for the layman, I suppose, listening in that might not understand what you mean by foresight in this context. Can you give us a definition for SME leaders?
Mm-hmm. Um, Foresight is really about systematically thinking about the future, and that involves anticipating what's coming, so making space and time to kind of do that regularly, then imagining what that means. So, okay, you might see something's coming down the horizon, you might spot a few trends, but imagining how the future of your business might be different in, say, 1, 3, 5, 10 years, whatever your time horizon might be. It's a whole other dimension to it. And then also preparing. Great to kind of do all these thought experiments, but what does that mean in terms of your kind of business strategy, and how can you embed some action, um, from the lessons that you pick up from systematically looking at the future.
Yeah.
So yeah, anticipate, imagine, prepare. Those are kind of the three pillars, I would say, of foresight.
Okay, really clear. Lots of people listening now will be going, "Sounds amazing, Like the idea makes perfect sense, but I've got HR issues, I've got cash flow challenges, I've got a client that's unhappy about the last thing a product I sent them. That's what I have to deal with.
Mhm.
I don't have the luxury of being able to look to the horizon. What's the pitch? Why is it so important?"
Yeah, and I'll just pick up on one word you said, which is that it feels like a luxury
Mm,
to do that. And I think the reality is that when you speak to most business leaders, though, and you kind of have a conversation with them about where, disruption comes from, they will most likely admit that they could have seen that disruption coming, but they just didn't really take the time to kind of address it and think about it a bit more.
mm,
A lot of the kind of business failures that we've seen in the past, that came from a lack of foresight as well, amongst other issues, of course, but that can be quite fundamental. So I understand that it can feel like a luxury, but if you're a company that wants to, not just survive but thrive in the future, then actually it's a necessity.
yeah,
Um,
and
and,
not that time consuming.
well,
For the sake of a few hours, probably you can spend some really quality time on this topic, can't you?
absolutely. So I think, coming back to what I said a bit earlier around it, this feeling like it's the domain of like big corporates that have a lot of budget, and they just set up foresight departments. Yes, they can do that, but there's a lot that's accessible to SMEs actually.
Mm,
um, whether that is kind of tools like horizon scanning, which we can go a little bit more into, but you can also do some things that are very simple, like say you've got a regular team meeting. Why not just take 5 or 10 minutes of that meeting and introduce a signal alert or a trends watch session, or something that kind of strengthens that foresight muscle and that foresight mindset for your organization.
mm.
So it doesn't require huge amounts of money and time. Just small nuggets and kind of snack size pieces you can embed throughout your processes can also be very, very powerful.
Yeah, okay, love it. So let's talk about that because that sounds like a really easy, practical takeaway. A signal alert. Just explain that in a bit more detail for those that might be unfamiliar with it, like me. What type of thing is being spoken about during that part of the meeting?
Um, So I can give you just an example, but it's, loads of businesses might kind of apply in different ways. Every single one of the people in your team will have read something interesting that is like that aha moment of like, wow, this is really quite something different or potentially disruptive. Um, why not share that with others? It seems like quite a straightforward thing, but most team meetings or kind of get-togethers tend to be focused on process, the agenda. So just share what you've seen that might be potentially disruptive for
Mm,
your organization. Um, and you can set your own kind of rules about what that might be. It could be a competitor, or it could be a partner doing something interesting, investing in a different type of industry. And you're thinking, wow, what's making them do that? They must have seen something. Let's dive deeper into that.
mm,
Um, Normally it can be things that are happening at the edges. It might be uh, something you've read, like a new policy or a new regulation that's being implemented in a different country. Slowly those things might come
yeah.
our way here in the UK, a little bit like we saw the social media, for example, in Australia being the first country to ban that for young people. And then you see they're the first, but it's kind of being rolled out across many countries. So those are just some examples of what you could include in that.
Yeah, I love it. Actually, you're making me think of something that we did a couple of years ago that I think I need to rejuvenate, which was we used to have something called an awareness list,
Okay.
which is essentially listing down the things that you're explaining.
Mm.
So it's a bit like I was going to say an engine warning light on your car, but that is something you have to do something about. Maybe it's a sign of wear and tear, and you don't need to do anything about it yet, but you need to be aware of it and keep an eye on it.
Mm.
And so the signals would go onto an awareness list, and you maybe just track them and actually are they moving up the agenda towards something which probably we need to address, or are they just remaining on the awareness list and they might drift past? But actually, if you think about every big disruption that there's ever been, they started as something relatively fringe, didn't they? And then
Exactly.
gradually came, or they disappeared. Okay, I love that. So that's the kind of nice practical cadence way of asking your team to lift their head up. Let's talk about horizon scanning as
Hmm.
an exercise. How does a team do this in like a nice formal setting? What would be the structure of getting your team around to do this a bit more proactively in a group environment, perhaps?
Yeah. Um, so let's kind of break it down into stages in terms of what you might do to kick things off all the way through to how you might act on that. So um, the first thing that you would do, say it was Keen that's doing that, for example, is you would kind of define some parameters that are particularly important for you, right? So policy and regulation around funding, for example, obviously super important. Um, Technological innovations, again, kind of look at those dimensions that you want to go away and expand on. Some organizations just use like the PESTLE framework of like political, economic, social, legal, technological, environmental,
Environmental,
trying to
yeah.
think through them, and kind of scanning across those. And, so it depends what might work for your business. But those are two angles. One, you might use like an off the shelf thing like Pestle. The other might be to pick certain dimensions that really matter to your own business.
Yeah.
The second element would be then to use that structure to conduct some research. And that research, I would say, needs to look at both some conventional sources of information, so stuff you're just picking up on the news or like business magazines, technology magazines, that kind of thing. But also, what I think is quite important is unconventional sources. So we just talked about fringe things happening, right? So if your space is consumer goods, are you like tracking Reddit threads about
Right.
like
Yeah. Okay.
weird things that might come up? Um, or, if you're in a climate, are you following patents and kind of the flow of patents for particular types of inventions that you're interested in? Um, and then what you do with that information, because at this point in time, is just that, right? Information. But what do you do with it? It doesn't, I would argue, have masses of value, inherent value on its own. Where the real value comes in is when you bring together your team, and what you can get them to do is think about what the impact of those signals is. So is it high impact, low impact in the context of your organization, right? And then the momentum and kind of the speed of change. So you mentioned, like, is it something we're just watching, or is it something that's actually picking up speed and is really being spread out throughout the economy really fast, and therefore we need to respond faster. So once you've got those two things, what that enables you to do as well, by having the team together come to that agreement and not have just a researcher, one individual do that, is that it kind of gives you, it brings buy-in, because the risk with these kind of things being handed to people is that they're like, well, I don't agree that the impact is 3 years, I think it's 10 years.
Sure.
Great. But the whole point of foresight is, it shouldn't really be an academic exercise. You need people to be aligned around what they're seeing as well. So it brings alignment and it brings buy-in, because people have contributed to the exercise. So then what that gives you is like an understanding of the signals that are out there, how likely they are to affect your business, and then when that might happen as well. You could end there, but I would argue that what makes it more powerful is to kind of think about what actions you take for each of those kind of quadrants. In my mind, I'm seeing it as like a quadrants. So, for example, if there's a trend that's coming up really, really fast, I would argue, and we can come back to this later, physical AI and kind of robotics is something that's picking up speed if I look at investment patterns in that space. So, okay, speed of change is high. Impact on your business might be high, because you might get a lot more businesses applying for funding in that space and needing more support. So is that like a bucket that of companies, or that you kind of focus on, and you decide, you know what, why don't we see how we can support businesses in this space, for example, and you kind of prioritize them for experimentation, for instance. The others might go on your watch list or awareness list, for example.
Yeah. It's interesting that you frame that as an opportunity. And when I asked you about the question, I was thinking this is about looking for risks, but you went straight to opportunity. Obviously, optimistic person. But would it be the same exercise for looking at opportunities and risks, or would you do the different exercise for different purposes?
I think it depends on your kind of what matters to you, right?
But you could argue both.
Absolutely.
I
And
want to hear about both.
yeah. But for instance, insurance companies do this quite a lot from a risk perspective, for instance, like they're scanning for emerging risks. But the reason they do that is because they can translate that into an opportunity if they are able to offer a product that de-risks,
of course,
right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a kind of a good example of how a risk can become an opportunity. And, I think that's where then other things come into play, like what are your capabilities? What are your own strengths and weaknesses? Where to play, how to win, like more strategic frameworks that drive action.
Yeah. I think what I really like about this process is, firstly, it's a structured environment where you bring everybody to the table. You're asking them to access the long-term thinking part of their brain. But there's a part which I don't think I've ever done before, which is the prior research across the PESTLE or equivalent buckets, so that you're almost starting the session by saying, these are 5 emerging trends that they're not kind of conjecture. They're things that we're seeing. That company's just launched this product. We've seen that company, really shrink their offering in that area, and we've seen this emerging trend. They're undeniable. And that sparks a really nice debate, as opposed to someone sat there going, I think we should really strongly consider this because I listened to a podcast about it or whatever, and then it's quite woolly and it becomes almost a fight about whether or not the topic's relevant as opposed to how the business might deal with or look at that opportunity.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a good way of kind of approaching it, in the sense that you do the research, right? You can, and when you're kind of bringing that together, it's important to not just say, oh, well, this is the signal, but what's the evidence for that signal?
Yeah.
But in a sense, the threshold for that evidence depends on other factors like organizational culture and things like alignment and buy-in,
Yeah.
and which are also important. But I think that's actually a really good example of how you can bring the two together.
Yeah. So let's use an example. You've got, I don't know, 25 to 100 people roughly in your business. How often are you running a session like this?
Like the workshop element of this.
Yeah.
The workshop element of it, you could do annually, as long as you kind of have embedded some mechanisms for action on the back of that, because the risk then becomes that it's just like a nice annual away day where we think about the future and do nothing about
a
it.
checkbox exercise.
Yeah. So how can you, I think that requires a little bit of thinking in terms of how can you ensure that there's continuity throughout like your business cycle. Say at the end of that workshop, you come up with some concepts for new business ideas. Okay, well, who's been tasked with pushing that forward and kind of perhaps doing a sprint around that, shaping it a little bit more, and reporting back at the next like quarterly review or whatever it might be, depending on your setup. You could do that. There are other, I think, realistically speaking, when I've worked with leadership teams, it's really hard to get them in the room a lot more regularly than that. I would say the one exception is when the business is really not doing very well. So when it comes to Foresight, what I've seen is that there's like two drivers. One is there's some companies that are just like naturally very forward thinking, want to be disruptive, want to always be ahead. And they're like, yes, we're always spotting new opportunities. So they kind of like get it, and they're happy to initiate it.
Yeah.
What can happen though quite a bit is companies kind of are facing like a bit of an existential crisis, right? And they're like, oh, wow, this is happening. How can we find something different? How can we pivot to something new? And then that's where Foresight can help you, because that's, you can look at the opportunities, you can map that to your strengths and weaknesses and identify those pockets where you can focus.
Is there quite an extreme kind of thought process exercise that you can run within this, which is, I guess, an alternative to Pestle, where you might look further down the track and go, what's our industry and business going to look like in, I don't know, 5-10 years time? And strip away kind of your preconceptions of where the industry is evolving, and almost kind of blank sheet of paper. Where could it be? What might it look like? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. So the way, if I've understood your question correctly, is kind of what other tools could businesses have in their like toolkit or arsenal of tools that they can draw on and really help them perhaps move not just from that anticipate piece that we mentioned, but also the imagination piece, right?
Yeah, I mean, Pestle seems like there's nudge and signals happening already.
Yeah.
I'm saying, what about forgetting those immediate things that are already happening and going, what are some of the leaps that we're predicting might happen?
Yeah. I would reframe the predicting slightly.
Yeah, okay.
In the sense that Foresight is not about being right and kind of making correct predictions. It's more about being ready. But that aside, you could do scenario planning, for example. So one project that I did recently was the future of supply chains, which has obviously been hugely disrupted by geopolitical changes and also environmental changes as well. So what you do in that situation is you would take those two kind of critical uncertainties, you might call them, and think about what would the future look like if, say, geopolitical fragmentation increases and climate change kind of disruption accelerates.
Yep.
And then what you could do is create visions of that future or stories from that future. And that can be quite powerful because it's really hard for us to imagine how things are going to be very different. So the scenario describes the world, but also your company in that possible world. So the scenarios are possible in the sense that they're based on critical uncertainties you see today, but they just get you to think a little bit differently. So scenario planning is one. The other thing you might do is, and I've done in the past, and it was super cool, is to work with science fiction writers. And the reason why that can be quite interesting is because it really kind of pushes people to go, oh, like, this is, in order for this to be real, I would really have to question a lot of assumptions that I hold today, right? What if? That's what they do really well, those kind of science fiction situations, is like, what if, there's so many different things, but depends. We could take like a particular sector or something and think that through. So yeah, scenario planning would be another one, and then science fiction would be another situation.
Yeah, super interesting, and I think really relevant and quite fun at the same time. You get the opportunity to say, what if the Suez Canal closed for 6 months? What's the scenario there?
Yeah.
What do we do? How would that affect us, and what backups do we have? I think a really interesting exercise. I want to touch on and unpack a little bit about something you mentioned, which was doing the exercise is part of the job, but it's only a fraction of the job. Then the execution is where obviously everything comes to life. I was doing a bit of a tidy up of our Notion kind of team page the other day, and my toes were curling from looking at kind of old strategy decks and notes and all sorts, and chucking them into the archive. But first of all, just having a quick look through and going, there's quite a lot of really good stuff in there that actually we should have done at that point, but it took us 12 months. And why did it take us 12 months and what have you? So certainly agree that the execution immediately after those strategy sessions is more important than the session itself. What practical tips do you have for leaders that struggle with the phase 2, I suppose?
The execution, kind of acting on part. It's, I mean, I get it. I get that it's hard to kind of maintain that, and it's hard to make the time and space. I guess the advice that I would give is to like reframe this kind of foresight exercise, not just as a nice to have, but actually something that's quite important. So if we think about how many of us categorize what we need to do, we focus on the urgent, important stuff, right? Understandably. And so once you reframe what your, the kind of element of foresight and the dimension of foresight as urgent and important for your business, then I think it will naturally make its way on your to-do list, on your agenda, and not just kind of postponed. I'd love to know what was on that deck that you didn't like. What
trade secrets already? No, some of it's maybe some dreams that never came to fruition or took longer to come to fruition, or strategic pivots where you go, actually we should have been faster at adopting technology perhaps. I think for me the best bits of advice, having looked at those decks and more recently got better at it, is working out who are the executors in your team and giving the execution to them. I know I'm a starter but not a finisher. but I've got lots of good executors around me. We recently did a really good one where we came up with a 100-day plan with stage check-ins throughout, and then the end of the 100-day plan, there's the where did we get to across the 8 things that were on the list, and then I think we'll probably do another 100-day check-in after that, and it just put a really neat framework around it. Strategy day, 100-day plan, 5 days later, divvy it out, and then 2 check-in sessions, and then one at the end of the 100 days, and then probably one 100 days later to see how we're tracking. Really simple, but actually that one's been really, really effective.
And that comes because you've considered it urgent and important to build those kind of,
to your
checklists,
point,
right?
it's
in your
top
business.
right in the quadrant. Yeah, absolutely. I want to change tack away from the practical horizon scanning foresight exercises to talking about AI and business leaders, and the kind of the common things that you see, perhaps some misconceptions that business leaders might have, or truths that maybe they consider truths that they're holding on to, and see if we can't challenge some of those assumptions, or unwind some of those preconceived ideas from your viewpoint. What are some of the things that you often hear that make you go, yeah, that's not quite right?
You mean among leadership teams, like in terms of thinking about the future, or more specifically about individual trends or things that they're seeing? Like,
maybe businesses shutting themselves off to some of the realities that are realities.
I think sometimes there's an element of so when I was young, I used to love Greek mythology, and there's a lot of like heroes in there, and when they think of themselves as like better than everyone else and better than the gods, then the fates come and strike them down to show them that you shouldn't be too arrogant. And I think that can happen quite a lot with some business leaders as well, in the sense of, one example is like Sam Altman. I don't know if you've seen the clips of him saying, like he was on a trip, I think, to India, and they were asking him, can someone do what you do like cheaper and better? And he was like, absolutely not. And then like a year later, DeepSeek came out of China and, kind of totally disrupted that thinking.
Sure.
I think that's just one, right? And it's kind of hard to generalize because people have different biases. We're all biased, not just business leaders, every single one of us. I think the other thing that can be quite hard, and I've seen quite a bit, is more around people focusing on what's recent. Like it's really hard to think about, things like ChatGPT coming out and totally disrupting what's happening. A few years ago, I think this must be back in like 2020 or 21, we did a survey of business leaders, and we gave them loads of different trends and asked them to think about what would the impact be, but also what kind of time horizon do they see them playing out in. And so something like knowledge factories and ChatGPT and generative AI was there. Very few of them thought that was going to be coming out anytime soon, or some of them thought that it would be impactful when it did, but they just didn't see it as something that was going to happen like in the next 5 years, and it did. But what they did prioritize instead, and what they thought would be more impactful, was stuff that was just more recent and in the news. So like more geopolitical conflict and stuff that can be naturally a bit more attention, like in media, captures kind of media attention.
Sure.
So it's like that recency bias can be quite hard.
Yeah.
So I sometimes say, what if generative AI is not like the biggest disruptor, but actually agentic AI is? Or thinking one step ahead, what if you embed generative AI into the new wave of robots that's coming out?
Yeah.
What if space-based technology was accessible to all business leaders, not just large corporates, including SMEs, right? As it becomes kind of more, as the costs come down. What if your headphones that you listen to, the podcasts are kind of tracking your brain activity, so that the sensors that you have are not just like monitoring the output of your body, but also like the, you know, the
Thoughts.
input, the thoughts that's going
Yeah.
into your brain. So those are some things
That
that
one's too
I could
much for
do,
me.
like, what if?
Yeah, that one's too much for me. So I think, I mean, I want to get on to talking about physical AI and robotics and a little bit later, and the kind of the fringe that's becoming less fringe as days go by, seemingly. Do you think that if a business leader if you were sat with a business leader saying, AI is not going to impact my business, and here's the reasons why, do you think we've got past that stage where people that are holding on to that, is that gone? You know, if are they so naive now that it's completely wrong to be thinking that? Do you see what I mean?
I do. I think I definitely agree that the debate around AI has shifted quite a lot. So, you know, I think if you'd asked most people 2 years ago, like I remember, say, going to presentations, webinars, and things, and people would be like, "Oh, but what are the use cases for AI? Like, can it really change the world? Can it really have an impact?" I've noticed I'm not getting those questions anymore. The questions I get are, um, is there a, you know, how do I help my people kind of upskill? What's the best place to embed AI in my business? Like different kind of questions. So the debate has and the conversation has definitely moved on in terms of adoption. I think that there's still such a long way to go though, and the risk is that there's, as with any technology, not just AI, there's a lot of hype, right? So more recently, that's been in the news quite a lot. Is it a bubble? Is there a hype? But that doesn't take away from what the technology can fundamentally do and the transformation potential that it has. So um, I think most people can relate to that on a personal basis, right?
Definitely. I think for anybody that is still in that camp, there's a book called The Coming Wave, which would change your opinion quite quickly, I think, because that is a very compelling argument that it's not coming. It's here, and it's the future, and it relates back to, have you read it? It relates back to the Industrial Revolution.
Is it Mustafa? No,
Yeah,
it is,
right?
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
I can't pronounce his surname either, but
I think it's Suleiman. Anyway,
but it was really interesting, and it talks about the printing press being one of the big first technical revolutions, because it took knowledge from needing to be handwritten through to being reproducible and therefore shareable, and took education to the next level. But it took decades for it to actually spread, and just the speed of change within this technical revolution has been unlike anything that's ever been seen before. And yeah, that I think it's very, when I read it, I went, this is serious. It's very serious.
And actually, the example you gave is a very good one in terms of that analogy of where we're at, right? So, economists refer to it as a general purpose technology, like something that is just going to completely transform economic systems. So if we draw analogies as well from electricity, initially companies were not kind of ready for the rollout of that technology. And I think something similar is happening now. And it took years before we could imagine what it could mean. I remember listening to someone give the example of Coca-Cola. So I think Coca-Cola was founded in the 60s or something. But the reason they were so successful is because refrigeration, having a cold a drink, for example, in a hot summer's day, and making that drink available all around the world. Now, when the electricity kind of, was invented and started being rolled out, most people saw it as like an automation and kind of cost-cutting exercise. Very few people can think of true, it's not necessarily I'm calling Coke innovative, but something completely new coming, right? A new product or a new innovation or something else coming.
Yeah.
Because it really takes time for that to diffuse through the economy and have an impact. And that's where Foresight, I think, can help, because it can help you imagine a world that's very different.
Yeah.
I think the other nuance with AI is that it's a bit of a catch-all term for a lot of different things. So AI, are we talking about just automation? No, not anymore, but we just still refer to it as AI. Are we talking about generative AI, there's so many and that doesn't help. I
Yeah,
think that.
yeah. You posted really recently an article or a thread that caught my attention. You were talking about AI literacy as a priority for businesses for their team. Uh, just talk to me about that because it feels like a really helpful practical application for a business. Firstly, what do you mean by AI literacy, and what are some of the things that small businesses could do to upskill their team?
Um, so the reason why I was writing about that is because, as you mentioned before, like a lot of businesses are thinking about AI, but also there's a whole kind of how do I go about it? And so far, a lot of people have focused on the technological angle of it, like who's my AI partner going to be? What's this? What kind of software or system or features, AI features, am I embedding into my technology, existing technology stack? But where adoption can be truly powerful and actually you can get to see the benefits of the technology is when your people know how to use it. um, so, giving access is kind of not enough if people don't understand how to use it, and B, how it can help them on their day-to-day life as well. So that's where I started looking a little bit more into the concept of AI literacy, which I also think needs a bit of a reframe, in
Mm.
the sense that if I did a poll recently and I was asking people, when you think of AI literacy, what do you think of? What do you think of? If I say AI like what are kind of just
Like an online
words?
learning course to about prompt engineering, perhaps, and
Yes.
safety within ChatGPT, how to embed it within my day-to-day work, that type of thing.
Exactly. And that's good. That's a starting point. We kind of all need that. But is it enough, would you say, in an AI era?
No, no,
Not
but scratching the
really.
surface, probably.
You're
Yeah,
scratching the
yeah.
surface, exactly. What you really need is to then think about, how is AI going to change who my competitors are in the future? We've seen this in the past, and actually history can be a great way to think about the future. Um, Technology companies disrupted so many of the things that, say, traditional companies were doing. Like, look at the financial sector, right? And the wave of neobanks and fintech coming up, and how they disrupted traditional
Sure.
banking models because of digital technology. So AI companies are now going to disrupt that as well, the kind of competitive landscape. Um, but who's looking at that space in the organization? I would argue that's also part of AI readiness. And more than that, I think there's also an element about how it's changing relationships, which is going to be absolutely huge, because
Mm.
it, I have a bit of an issue with the way that economists look at work, which is just tasks. A role is a compilation of tasks. Great for doing the analysis, the economic analysis. Is that what it feels like to most people? I mean, that's quite a depressing thought, I would
Mm.
argue. Um, if we really want a great future of work, it has to be more than a accumulation of tasks. It's about the relationships you have with your colleagues, your partners, your customers, right?
Mm.
So how is it changing those relationships? I think that's like an even bigger piece of the puzzle,
Mm.
that we need to be thinking about, and
Yeah.
are definitely not enough. It's very, very underexplored.
I'm tossing up whether or not we get into the conversation about education here or not, because it's all tied together, isn't it? Do you ban students from using AI entirely so they need to exercise that brain? Or do they take your way of thinking and go, they need soft skills and the ability to understand how AI works and to use it? There's two quite big different schools of thoughts there.
Yeah. I it's a hard one. There was a really good podcast that The Economist did recently on the intelligence series, which was about AI in education, and it caught my eye because there's AI detectives that kind of like try and spot when ChatGPT has been used in essays.
Sure.
And so it was kind of giving. two sides of the coin of like these detectives saying, they kind of put white text in the exercises they give to students that doesn't come up for you, but will if you kind of copy stuff over from ChatGPT. And then there's other educators that are basically saying, look, we all know students are using it, right? Like, why deny the reality
Yeah.
around us? How can we show them how to use it well so that they're not copying pasting? I mean, when Google search came out, we had that debate. I think I'm now getting old enough where I'm starting to like draw from history myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what happens.
Wikipedia, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And
Yeah.
it's like, should you use it? Oh no, we should just ban everyone from using it. Calculators, okay, I don't remember that part, but I know there was a debate around that.
I remember arguing with maths teachers and them saying, well, you're not going to be able to carry a calculator around in your pocket.
Well,
Ah.
I think that there are fundamental differences. Like a calculator doesn't hallucinate. ChatGPT does. And then you get into all sorts of issues around the truth and what the truth is. And if you give me one kind of version of the truth and someone else gives me another, like, for me, what I think might happen is we'll have something like social media and the polarization that created on steroids.
Yeah.
Because it's just like so much more powerful, right? When you're interacting with ChatGPT or Claude or whatever your tool might be that you're using, and you're developing a relationship with that tool, when they become like your trusted thought partner, then you're just more likely to believe what they're saying. You're even more in your bubble. So I don't know, projecting out into the future, that, to be honest, worries me a little bit.
So I think you've got a son, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what if I don't know, how old is your son?
He's 6.
6. Okay, so he's a little way off choosing his higher education, but like, where do you think the future of work is? And what skills do you think young should be prioritizing?
I don't know what he will study or kind of, any of that. I think, things might change a lot until then. But what I'm trying to teach him from now actually is that he has to never stop learning. Because what he learns today is good enough for today, but you're always going to have to learn something new. And I think that's not just for a 6-year-old, that's for all of us, right? So if you don't learn how to use the tools, understand what they can and cannot do, you might increasingly be left out of the opportunities that those technologies can bring. And so the world is moving so fast, or at least it feels like it. I think the most important thing that I can teach him is like, just don't be like, oh yeah, I've studied this, I'm fine, No, always keep learning, be curious, carry on, kind of just picking up new things. Yeah.
It's growth mindset for a 6-year-old, but it also is relevant for a 56-year-old, isn't it?
Anyone.
It's so true. I think as we get a little bit longer in the tooth and more experienced in our various domains, you end up building walls around you and saying, no, that's how it's done. I'm experienced now. But actually that's the worst way of approaching things. And I think that's the biggest lesson I'm learning from you is you've got to be prepared to be wrong and for things to be changing and ready for that change at all times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in many ways it's kind of down to you what you make of that, of the change that's coming. Some people say it's going to be like a great divider when we talk about AI, for example. Others say it will be the great equalizer. It kind of depends on what we do with it, right? If we all decide not to learn how to use it, adopt it in the right way, educate ourselves in, different ways, do the same for our children, but also others around us, our parents, other people around us, then yeah, it might be a divide, it might increase divides in our world, but also it could be an enabler for them. So I think if you feel like something's happening to you, you're less empowered to act. If you feel like it's just a tool and it's down to you like learn and decide. It's just, as you say, more of a growth kind of mindset and empowering approach.
Yeah.
And that's what I always try and encourage people to do.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're almost there, and I would love to keep talking, but I think what I've taken away from this is a really positive view. You have such an optimistic mindset towards this period of change, and when you think back at some of the big markers that we've spoken about, the printing press, electricity, automation, huge moments in history. Actually, we're living through one of those now in a really real way, and I think all of the disruption that we're feeling, it's all because of that change. And yeah, there's a lot more to come. Like, I think I've said it a couple of times on this podcast. It feels really early in this journey, and we're going to laugh at ChatGPT and go, we used to ask it questions, and now it just does stuff for us without even, us prompting it. That's where it's at.
It already is doing that.
Yeah.
So
I just haven't set it up correctly, clearly. But yeah, I think I've taken a really positive takeaway. What would you like to leave our listeners, these business leaders of small businesses, thinking about as your kind of final thought for them?
A couple of thoughts. One is that don't worry about being right and kind of predicting the future. Focus more on kind of imagining it and just being ready. I think that reframe can be very powerful. And also, you really don't need a lot of, you don't need a big budget, big departments to do that. What you need is more of that mindset and small ways to embed that into your organization, the things that you already have in your business. So something is better than nothing.
Yeah. I love that challenge. How do you build agility into your business so that you can pivot and react?
Yeah.
That's a great challenge for I think us to leave this on. But Athena, thank you so much for coming in and for your time today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Behind the SME. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. It really helps others find the show. If you want to get in touch, you can find our email in the description. Until then, keep building, keep learning, and we'll see you next time.